shiny ponies trotting through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by.
That's how Rudyard Kipling, who lived in the Weald, conjured up the sinister atmosphere of the smuggling activities for which the region had once been famous. During the Middle Ages, men would risk the death penalty to smuggle valuable wool supplies out of the country. Then, between the 17th and the 19th centuries, luxury goods were smuggled inwards, goods such as brandy, tobacco, tea and lace. This contraband was landed at places all along the Cinque Ports and Romney Marsh coastline, at Hastings, Winchelsea, Rye, Dungeness, Lydd, Dymchurch, Lymm and Hythe. It was then smuggled to hiding places throughout the coastal towns and countryside of Kent and Sussex. Most people in the Weald were involved in the trade in one way or another, if only as the furtive recipients of goods which they would otherwise not be able to afford. Consequently, it was difficult for customs officers to control the situation, for even magistrates and jury members were likely to have cellars full of illicit goods acquired from those on trial. But there were organised gangs which were not popular. For example, the Hawkhurst gang, which operated within the Sussex-Kent border country. The medieval Mermaid Inn at Rye was a particularly notorious smuggler's haunt, and an 18th century inhabitant of the town described how the Hawkhurst gang were seen in the Mermaid after a successful run.
Carousing and smoking their pipes with their loaded pistols on the table before them, no magistrate daring to interfere with them.
At Dymchurch every other summer, there's a Day of Sin festival, which includes a colourful pageant based on Russell Thorndike's novels about the fictional parson smuggler Dr. Sin. This famous character symbolised all the smuggling activities of Romney Marsh. So what made this region of coast and marshland so vital to smugglers then and to other forms of trade before and since? What made the Weald a thriving centre for the cloth and iron industries during the Middle Ages and for the growing of hops and fruits that have made Kent known as the Garden of England? And what made the region so attractive to medieval and Tudor courtiers that they established here an impressive array of castles and fine houses? The area was, and is, in a constant state of geological evolution. Towns which were at one time thriving ports are now inland and stand on fossil cliffs, surveying expanding marshland instead of the sea. As a result, inhabitants of the region have had to adapt their industries and their lifestyles to suit the changing environment. So before we look more closely at the significance of the rich heritage and beauty that the Weald of Kent and East Sussex has to offer, let's take a brief look at the unique geology which lies behind the prestige, magnificence and prosperity which the region has enjoyed since the Middle Ages. Including its chalk rim, the geological area known as the Weald is broadly the three counties of Kent, Sussex and Surrey. More specifically, it is the Great Valley lying between the North and South Downs. Many of the sedimentary rocks found here are not much represented in areas further north in England because they consist of sands and clays laid down in a unique lake which existed between 135 and about 100 million years ago during the Cretaceous period. This lake extended over what is now southeast England and across to what is now northern France. We can turn back the geological clock and picture what this landscape would have looked like. On the shores of the Wealden Lake was a landscape featuring mainly non-flowering plants such as horsetails, rushes and ferns. Flowering plants were still in the early stages of evolution. And in this environment lived dinosaurs such as the iguanodon. At Scotney Castle near Lamberhurst, which we'll be looking at later, you can see the cast of a dinosaur's foot preserved in the sandstone. You can also see there ripple marks from the bed of the Wealden Lake. The lake itself contained fresh to brackish water. On the bed of it there accumulated a layer of sands and muds, mainly deposited by the rivers which flowed into the lake. These sediments are now collectively known as the Hastings Beds. They contain a lot of iron-rich sandstone, and this was to become important to the economy of the Weald during the Middle Ages, as we shall see. As the uplands were eroded and worn down, the deltas grew, but were often flooded as the water level changed. Now the rivers brought down mainly fine particles. These were deposited on top of the Hastings Beds as a layer of clay. This layer, known as the Weald clay, is now used for brickmaking.
This is our stockpile of clay at Chiddingstone Brickworks. It's a Weald clay, a Kent Weald clay, which is very good for brickmaking. It goes into a mass very easily once you mix water and gets very plastic. After the clay is dug from here, it's transported to the works by a shovel, where it is fed into a wet pan where water and coke breeze is added. The pan then mixes up into a homogeneous mass which is very plastic, which is fed then into a lintop mill on to the making table. When it arrives on the making tables, it is roughly about 30% moisture and very plastic. After the clay is received onto the table, you will see the makers rolling their clay into what we call a walk, where the sand is mixed into the surface before it is thrown into the mould. After it is thrown into the mould, it is then lifted and put onto what we call a hacking barrow, which takes it to the drying. In the drying, these bricks are then stacked and dried, ready to go into a kiln, a Scotch kiln as we have here, for the firing process. And of course the advantage of any handmade brick is the variation in texture. You will find that each and every brick has a different variation in texture.
About 100 million years ago, the sea gradually began to wash over the Wealden Lake, so turning it into a shallow marine bay. Slowly, a new layer of sands and muds built up on top of the Weald clay, forming what is now known as green sand. That's the type of rock from which the famous Kentish ragstone is quarried. As the sea spread further and the rivers became more distant from the basin of the original Wealden Lake, it was once again finer-grained particles which were deposited within that basin. These accumulated on top of the green sand, forming a type of clay called galt clay. And on top of that stratum there had accumulated by about 65 million years ago a layer of shells from marine animals, which formed chalk. At that time, the sea here was warm and clear, and the land around it possibly a desert due to a hot, dry climate. This would explain why the chalk is so pure. There were few nearby rivers to deposit sediment in the sea. The chalk gradually built up to a thickness of 1,000 feet and more. It's visible on parts of the North and South Downs, but probably its best-known outcrop is the famous White Cliff Line at Dover. So gradually, over a period of millions of years, several thick layers of rock had built up in the basin of the Wealden Lake. Then, 25 million years ago, these rocks were buckled upwards into a huge dome by the same earth movements which formed the Alps. And then gradually the most exposed part of the dome, the top, began to be weathered away by wind, rain and rivers. The more resistant rocks tended to form either ridges, like the steep Greensand Ridge on which towns such as Sevenoaks and Maidstone are built, or high upland areas, like those at the core of the Weald around Tunbridge Wells, where there are massive outcrops of weathering-resistant sandstone. This is the sandstone laid down in the original freshwater Wealden Lake. But where the rocks were softer and more easily eroded, they formed vales. For example, the wide clay areas where Headcorn, Marden, Yalding and Edenbridge are sited. Very gradually, the exposed rocks of the Weald became covered by a dense forest, a forest which until the beginning of the Middle Ages stretched for 120 miles east to west and about 30 miles north to south. Part of that original Wealden forest can still be seen today, the largest remaining tract being the Ashdown forest. The rest of it has progressively been cleared by man, as he has attempted from the early Middle Ages onwards to turn the Weald into a habitable and productive region. The Anglo-Saxons started by colonising hirsts or woodland clearings. Indeed, the word hirst still survives as a prefix or suffix to place names all around the region today. The clearance of the forest continued after the Norman conquest, though it was hindered for a while because much of the area was declared to be royal hunting ground, a stipulation which caused a lot of friction between the new king and his subjects. But legal or illegal clearing did take place, often in return for fines paid to the king, and so more and more people settled in these hirsts in the Weald and began to exploit the available resources. Most of the soil was not fertile enough to be cultivated, but the vast supply of trees gave rise to a whole range of wood-based crafts. People developed skills in wheel-making, sawing, carpentry, arrow-making and bow-making, traditional crafts which are still practiced in the area today. In Kent, unlike other areas, people were at liberty to switch from one trade to another. While in most parts of the kingdom all lands and rights over tenants passed on the owner's death to his eldest son, in Kent the law of gavelkind existed, whereby lands were divided amongst all male heirs. People were free to buy and sell their land, their labour and their produce, and because they were so independent they could acquire several skills and benefit from all of them. From the 13th century onwards, iron mining also became an important industry in the Weald, because the local sandstones were found to be rich in deposits of iron. The iron industry became fairly widespread in the area, although the Sussex Weald is probably the best known for it. Here, the metalworking industry began to produce horseshoe nails, anchors for royal ships, arrowheads, spades, picks and hatchets, and various other weapons and agricultural implements. The great Sussex iron industry was to reach its peak in the early 17th century. Today, the National Trust owns a property near Burwash in East Sussex, which was built in 1634, probably by a wealthy ironmaster. Known as Bateman's, and little altered since the 17th century, the house was bought in 1902 by Rudyard Kipling, who then lived there until his death in 1936. In his study at Bateman's, Kipling wrote many of his works, including the children's book Puck of Pook's Hill, with its song about the region's smugglers.
Through the dark, brandy for the parson, baccy for the clerk. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentleman...
Bateman's is just one of many areas of historic interest or natural beauty maintained by the National Trust all over the Weald, and we'll be looking at others during the course of the programme. The Trust organises all sorts of events at its properties, ranging from guided country walks to concerts and open-air theatre performances, such as this production of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, being performed at Bateman's by the Oast Theatre Company. You can get all the details of such events from the National Trust's regional office at Lamberhurst, but it's worth bearing in mind that the properties are especially crowded on Sundays and bank holidays, and you'll enjoy your visit much more if you avoid those times.
Did you hear what I was playing, Lane?
I didn't think it polite to listen, sir.
Well, I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play accurately. Anyone can play accurately, but I play with wonderful expression. As far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte. I keep science for life.
Yes, sir.
And speaking of the science of life, have you got the cucumber sandwiches cut for Lady Bracknell?
Oh, yes, sir.
So, as we've seen, most of the industry in the Weald during the Middle Ages was geared to the natural resources of forests and iron-rich sandstone. Most of the soils were not very suited to agriculture, with the exception of the well-drained soil on the lower Greensand Ridge. But during the course of the Middle Ages, the wide clay vales began to be artificially drained, in particular by the church, which owned a lot of land in the area. These stretches consequently became quite fertile, and from the 16th century onwards, orchards and cattle pastures began to spread from the greensand soils across the clay plain onto the high Weald, where there are richer soils in the valleys between the sandstone outcrops. Romney Marsh was another region in which the medieval church owned a great deal of land. In geological terms, the marsh is the most recent addition to the Weald. Here again, the church set about draining the land, so helping to give rise to another great industry for which the Weald was to become famous in the Middle Ages, the cloth industry. This industry had its origins in wool from the sheep kept on the drained marsh, as we shall see. Romney Marsh was once part of a bay which gradually silted up, partially as a result of alluvial materials being deposited there by the rivers Rother, Brede and Tillingham. They were, of course, bringing it from other parts of the Weald, from which it had been eroded. This process of deposition is still occurring, and so the marsh continues to be in a state of geological evolution. Thus, Romney Marsh is still expanding, and as it does so, the sea retreats further and further from the old cliff line. But to begin with, the land here just consisted of offshore sandbanks, many of which were granted by the Anglo-Saxon kings in about the 8th century to various monastic houses. The monks of these houses set about draining the sandbanks, to which more silt was constantly being added. The result was that by the mid-13th century, a considerable amount of what is now Romney Marsh had been reclaimed by the church, and settlements had sprung up around churches built on the raised sites of the original sandbanks. Some of these churches are now subsiding, because the unstable sands on which they were built have shifted. Probably the oldest settlement in the marsh is Lydd, which is mentioned by name in a charter of AD 740. In the early 16th century, the vicar of Lydd was the great Thomas Wolsey. The son of an Ipswich butcher, he was to rise during the reign of Henry VIII to the eminent positions of Archbishop of York, Cardinal and Lord Chancellor. Indeed, as a vital and highly influential advisor to the king, he was to become one of the most powerful men in Western Europe, before losing the royal favour and ultimately being arrested for high treason. But in the earlier years, when the ambitious Wolsey was building his career, this medieval ragstone church at Lydd was under his care. It was constructed on the site of a Saxon building, of which you can still see traces today, here in the northwest wall. The money for its construction came from the fortunes made by the local wool trade. Because the medieval monks on Romney Marsh had drained the land so successfully, sheep could be reared here, the long wool type of sheep for which the marsh is still so famous today. Indeed, the Romney Marsh sheep are the main Kentish breed, and they're direct descendants of the type kept in Roman Britain. They have a heavy, even fleece, and their wool became of vital importance during the 13th century, when England shipped wool to Flanders, where it was made into cloth. But as the Flemish industry declined due to a drop in the population, England began to produce its own cloth and export it, so that by the middle of the 15th century, cloth exports had overtaken wool exports in value. The Weald of Kent became an important cloth-making centre, partly because of its supply of wool from the Romney Marsh sheep, and partly because of its nearness to the major ports. But another important reason was that the people of the Weald were available to take up cloth-making. They were not as heavily involved in farming as people in other, more fertile areas. So, by the mid-15th century, small villages, which a century earlier had perhaps just a fulling mill and a few weavers, had become major cloth-producing centres. Those villages included Biddenden and Smarden on the Weald Clay, and Goudhurst, Tenterden and Cranbrook in the High Weald at the centre. Some of the weavers had come over from Flanders, encouraged by grants of protection from Edward III in the mid-14th century, but the vast majority were natives of the Wealden countryside. Nor were all spinners and weavers poor folk working in their homes for a wealthy clothier. Some were prosperous property-owning folk, merging into the lower ranks of the clothiers who sold their cloths to exporters, merchants and Londoners. The cloth industry brought great prosperity to the Weald in the late Middle Ages, and this continued into the 16th century. But as drainage systems were improved and more areas could be cultivated, the Weald was able to gain prosperity by producing orchard fruit and hops, as well as cereals such as oats, wheat and barley. With the introduction of improved machinery, for example seed drills in the 18th and 19th centuries, the yields of such crops became even better, and in the 19th century the Wealden countryside became dotted with the picturesque oast houses and windmills for which the region is now famed. In Cranbrook, for example, once a major centre for the weaving industry, you can visit Union Mill, which was built in the early 19th century. At 72 feet high, it's the second highest in England. The mill is now a Grade 1 listed building and is in the care of the Kent County Council. Having been fully restored, it's maintained as a working mill by the Cranbrook Windmill Association. While the milling of flour is a typical Wealden industry, so too is the brewing of beer from hops grown in the area. At Allington Lock, near Maidstone, you can visit at the Museum of Kent Rural Life a typical 19th century oast house. Here, hops were once dried and prepared for the brewing process. At the museum, you can also see a whole range of fields, woods and orchards. These are designed to give the visitor an insight into the development through the centuries of different types of farming, not only in the Weald, but also in other parts of Kent. So the Weald remained a prosperous region from the early Middle Ages onwards, and that prosperity was due partly to its proximity both to London and to Europe. But the fact that it is so close to Europe has meant that through the centuries its coast has been vulnerable to attack. The Romans, having themselves successfully invaded England, saw the need to build coastal strongholds to defend the shore against further invaders. Here at Lymm, for example, they built a fort. That was in the days before the silting up of Romney Marsh, when this was a cliff and Roman galleys lay here in the harbour of Portus Lemanis. The Roman fort here, which lies immediately below the medieval Lim Castle, is today still known by the name the Anglo-Saxons gave it after the Romans had left, Stutfall or Stoutwall Castle. It's now in ruins, but it was once quite formidable, about 10 acres in extent, with walls 20 feet high and about 12 feet thick. From Roman defences such as this to the defences against Napoleon of the early 19th century, the ports of the Kent and Sussex coast have retained their strategic importance. The Royal Military Canal is now a beautiful, tranquil waterway flowing through the Romney Marsh countryside and forms the setting for Hythe's Venetian Fete, held every second year. But it was originally built by the order of Prime Minister William Pitt as part of a scheme of defence against Napoleon's threatened invasion. Another part of the scheme was a string of Martello towers built to provide gunfire all along the Kent and Sussex coast. However, none of these measures was ultimately put to the use for which it was intended. Nelson's victory over Napoleon at the naval battle of Trafalgar in 1805 removed the threat of invasion. But the coastal strongholds for which Kent and Sussex are most famous are the Cinque Ports, which first came into being in the 11th century during the reign of Edward the Confessor. Probably all the shires at that time had the duty of providing ships for the Royal Navy, and all men liable to military service could be required to man the King's fleet, commanded by the King himself and his earls. But the ports of Dover, Sandwich, Romney, and probably Hythe and Hastings had a particular contract. They each had to provide 20 ships with crews of 21 men once a year for 15 days. So how was Duke William of Normandy able to land unopposed at Pevensey on the 28th of September 1066 and to proceed from there to Hastings? It seems from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that certain economies had been made in the English Navy by that time, so presumably the men of the Cinque Ports didn't have the necessary backup to enable them to defend the Channel effectively. And of course King Harold's army was engaged in battle further north when William's men arrived, so they weren't there to defend the shoreline. Today, you can visit the site at Battle where William's men defeated the Saxons and killed King Harold. The site now belongs to English heritage, as does the abbey, which William set up as a means of thanking God for his victory. According to tradition, the altar of the abbey was placed on the spot where King Harold fell. The terrace of the abbey's precinct stands where the English took up their positions. From it you can look today across the deep gully to the lower hillock further south, where the Norman forces were drawn up. At that time the gully was considerably deeper than it is today, so their final successful charge up the hill and dislodging of the English from their advantageous position was no small achievement. The abbey itself was endowed with a lot of land and became very rich. The monks indulged in large and varied meals and had a generous allowance of a gallon of wine per monk per week. But they adhered diligently to their religious duties and gained for the abbey an excellent reputation. In the early 12th century, a chronicler described it as
second to none in England for observance, goodness, gentleness, charity, and charitable deeds.
Perhaps because of the ease with which William of Normandy was able to invade England, after the conquest he set about constructing fortifications to defend the English coast. Built along the lines of castles, which were at that time being used to great effect in Normandy, castles were constructed on the cliff top, both at Hastings and at Pevensey. Here, the Roman coastal fortress of Anderida was converted by William's half-brother, Robert de Mortain, into a castle. Strong enough to withstand sieges later by William Rufus, King Stephen, Simon de Montfort and Richard II, Pevensey Castle was finally abandoned by 1500, by which time the silting up of the coast had rendered it less strategically important. But although it fell prey to quarrying in the centuries after, the great strength of the masonry has meant that most of Pevensey's ancient Roman walls and its massive medieval towers have survived. Now owned by English Heritage, this once great Norman castle can still be visited today. Another Norman castle was built at Tunbridge, at the opposite end of the core of the Weald. This castle, built to guard an important ford over the Medway, was at first a timber motte and bailey construction, but was strengthened at the beginning of the 13th century. Like Pevensey, Tunbridge Castle became involved in several revolts against kings of England in the Middle Ages. But unlike Pevensey, it was not able to withstand the sieges these revolts provoked, and it was captured first by William Rufus, then later by King John and Henry III. Nevertheless, Tunbridge remained one of the great castles in Kent, and was later owned by descendants of Edward I, including the great Dukes of Buckingham. Today, sadly, most of this once great fortress is in ruins. But the impressive early 14th century gatehouse can still be visited. It's now in the care of the Tunbridge and Malling Borough Council. So the early Normans did much to fortify the Weald in their attempt to establish a firm hold on the Kingdom of England. But once the Norman kings were secure here, the loss of their former Duchy of Normandy to the French during King John's reign meant that the Kent and Sussex coast and the Channel crossing were vulnerable to foreign invasion. So further fortifications were needed. Edward I issued a charter in 1278 which established in legal form the services and privileges of the Cinque Ports Confederation. The services consisted of supplying ships and seamen for the defence of the coast and sea passage on the king's behalf, which meant in practice that the Cinque Ports were to provide the nucleus for the royal fleet. Because of this, their power and prestige were considerable, and they were accordingly given unique privileges. You can see a copy of Edward I's charter in Hythe Museum. Some of the terminology sounds quite intriguing. Apparently, the Cinque Portsmen were entitled to the following:
exemption from tax and tallage, sack and sock, toll and team, bloodwit, fledwit, pillory and tumbril, infrangant theft, outfrangant theft, mundbrifes, waifs and strays, right to flotsam, jetsam, lagan, privilege of assembly as a guild, rights of den and strond, and honours at court.
Roughly translated, in reality this meant that they enjoyed exemption from certain taxes and tolls, had certain judicial rights within their boundaries, and could claim the right to spoils from wrecks washed ashore at the ports. They were also given permission to land, dry their nets and sell fish at Yarmouth in Norfolk, and to control the annual Yarmouth Herring Fair. But these particular privileges were to lead to great animosity between the portsmen and the men of Yarmouth, to such an extent that during a war with France in 1294, the Cinque Portsmen, on sighting Yarmouth ships assembling against the French, forgot the common enemy and fought their supposed allies. After that, the king ordered that the Cinque Ports and Yarmouth ships were to be kept apart in future. The medieval ports of Rye and Winchelsea were included in the Federation as the two ancient towns and were later raised to the position of head ports. Today, they are both inland, but they each played their part in opposing the French, both during Edward I's reign and during that of his grandson, Edward III. During the 1330s, there was far more reason for war with France than there had been in the 1290s. Not only were the English and French kings continuing to argue over Gascony, which the King of England held as vassal of the King of France, but now Edward III was actually claiming a right to the throne of France. He made his claim on the grounds that he, as the late king's grandson, had a greater right to the throne than the Valois claimant, who was the late king's nephew. Thus, the struggle which began in 1337 was much more serious than the earlier conflicts and became the start of the 100 Years' War. The great English victories in France at Crécy and Poitiers led to ferocious retaliation by the French, which took the form of raids along the southeast coast. Winchelsea and Rye suffered particularly. In 1359, about 3,000 Frenchmen landed at Winchelsea harbour and broke into the town. They set fire to houses, and bursting into the church of St Giles, they massacred the vast majority of Winchelsea's inhabitants, who were celebrating Mass there. Then, in 1377, an army of Frenchmen left the whole town of Rye a smouldering ruin. Because it was feared that the French would advance inland, during the 1380s, Richard II ordered two castles to be built: Scotney in Kent and Bodiam in East Sussex, both of which are now owned by the National Trust. Scotney was the first to be built. Now a picturesque moated ruin set in beautiful gardens maintained by the Trust, this castle was constructed by Roger de Ashburnham in 1380. It was later sold to Henry Chichele, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the 15th century, and belonged to his family for nearly 400 years. Scotney was sold in 1778 to the Hussey family, who later created the spectacular gardens which can today be enjoyed by visitors. Other modern-day attractions here include the open-air theatre performances, which take place every summer on the lawns next to the castle ruins. Bodiam Castle was built by the French Wars veteran Sir Edward Dahlingrig to defend the Rother Valley. It was basically a larger-scale version of Scotney, a moated castle, rectangular in plan with 4 round corner towers and a gatehouse. Bodiam's wide moat was designed to prevent the bombardment of the walls at point-blank range, but the anticipated French invasion never came. Now the lake-like moat gives the castle a fairy tale appearance as the grey walls rise sheer from the water. But not all of the Weald's medieval castles were built for defence purposes. Lymm Castle, perched on the top of the fossil cliff above the old Roman remains of Stutfall Castle, was built for the archdeacons of Canterbury during the Middle Ages. The church had been granted a lot of lands across the Weald after the Norman conquest, and among them was the site at Lymm, where there had probably once been a Roman watchtower and then, later, a Saxon religious house. Lymm Church and the first archdeacon's residence beside it were built by Lanfranc, the new Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, soon after the conquest. To build them, he may well have ordered the use of stones from the ancient Roman fortress further down the cliff. Most of the present castle, though, dates from about 1360, including the magnificent Great Hall, although its fireplace and panelling were added in Tudor times. This hall is where the archdeacons would have dined when staying at Lymm, which they owned right up until the 19th century. From the parapet of the tower at the western end of the castle, you can now get a superb view across Romney Marsh, where once there was a harbour. The church was an integral part of medieval life in the region. Its property ranged from the splendour of the cliff-top castle overlooking the marshes it had cultivated to the solitude and simplicity of isolated abbeys, such as this one in the heart of the Weald. Bayham Abbey, near Lamberhurst, was founded at the turn of the 13th century in a secluded level valley where there was a plentiful supply of water. This abbey housed a typical medieval monastic community. Here, as in monasteries all over Europe, the monks would rise at 2 in the morning for a day consisting of prayer, mass, psalm singing, meditative reading and study, and would retire again to bed at about 7 p.m. But in addition to their normal duties, they also provided vital food and shelter for pilgrims, the poor and the afflicted. Bayham Abbey was suppressed in 1525, despite a sit-in staged by the canons, their servants and some of the local people. But its impressive ruins, now in the care of English Heritage, bear witness to the peace and tranquility of the monastic life of the past. So the church made use of the pleasant and fertile regions of the Weald, and so from medieval times did wealthy and important families who wanted to live outside London but within easy reach of the court. The whole of the Weald was within easy travelling distance of the capital, and so while some purchased and converted existing castles, others built fine houses in the most fertile and or strategically important areas. Up on the Greensand Ridge, where there was a plentiful supply of the Kentish ragstone so suitable for building, the Archbishop of Canterbury himself purchased a property in 1456. The property was a rough medieval manor here at Knowle near Sevenoaks, and Archbishop Bourchier transformed it into a palace fit for the Primate of England. He and his successor, Archbishop Morton, made great alterations and additions, rendering the house so large and magnificent that the covetous Henry VIII finally obliged Archbishop Cranmer to
deliver his house up into the king's hands.
So Knowle became a royal residence before it was granted to the Sackville family by Elizabeth I. Today, Knowle, set in a beautiful deer park, is in the care of the National Trust, and is on occasion the setting for events such as this spectacular festival. You can also see there one of the most important collections of 17th century furniture in the world. Not far from Knowle, and still on the Greensand Ridge, a rather more modest but still beautiful manor house was constructed here at Ightham. Ightham Moat now, like Knowle, belongs to the National Trust, but during the 600 years of its existence it has belonged to a variety of owners, including a Tudor courtier and a former Lord Mayor of London. Throughout the centuries, Ightham Moat's original 14th century Great Hall has remained the heart of the manor. Intriguingly, it contains the hint of a mystery. When one of the doorways, once blocked up, was reopened in 1872, behind it was found the seated skeleton of a young woman. Further along the green sand ridge from Ightham, in another great hall here at Allington Castle, Henry VIII was entertained by his courtier, Sir Henry Wyatt. That was in July 1536, just after the king had released Sir Henry's son, Sir Thomas Wyatt, from imprisonment in the Tower of London. We don't know why Sir Thomas was imprisoned, but it may well be because he had been suspected of a former affair with Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second queen, and the mother of Elizabeth I. But Sir Thomas Wyatt survived the incident and went on to become a famous poet, courtier and diplomat. The days of Allington Castle's Tudor splendour are often relived in a colourful medieval market held here in the castle and grounds. Sir Thomas Wyatt had in fact probably known Anne Boleyn from childhood, because their fathers had been colleagues, friends and neighbours in the Weald of Kent. The Boleyns owned Hever Castle, about 20 miles from Allington, in the clay vale between the green sand ridge and the sandstone core. Anne's great-grandfather, Geoffrey Boleyn, had built Hever as a comfortable manor house within an existing moat and curtain wall. At that time, the immediate precincts of the castle were largely surrounded by wooded marshland, due to the fact that it was sited on low clay soil close to the River Eden. But when William Waldorf Astor began to restore the castle after purchasing it in 1903, he transformed the marshes and low meadows around it into beautiful gardens and a 30-acre lake. Despite the changes, Hever Castle still retains its Tudor atmosphere. You can almost imagine the days of Henry VIII's courtship of Anne Boleyn, the days of the king's infatuation with her, when he even sent his own physician to Hever in his anxiety to have her cured of the dangerous sweating sickness. Not far from Hever, but on the higher and older sandstone of the High Weald, is another medieval manor, Penshurst Place. Once the property of the brothers of King Henry V, Penshurst probably reached the peak of its glory during the reign of Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I. The 14th century manor had been granted to the Sidney family by Elizabeth's brother, Edward VI, and that family still owns Penshurst Place today. The great Elizabethan poet, Sir Philip Sidney, was born at Penshurst, and although he grew up in the Queen's household, he later wrote much of his poetry here. But despite Sir Philip's great literary talent and his reputation as a paragon of courtly virtues, the Queen took a dislike to him because of his outspokenness. However, she did visit his brother Sir Robert Sidney at Penshurst sometime after Sir Philip's death. Elizabeth was entertained with musicians and dancers here in the Great Hall, where her father, Henry VIII, had once dined. She ate 2 helpings of sugary cake, drank cordial from a gold cup, and then went outside with her hosts and their company to watch some feats of gallantry being performed on horseback. The visit was towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, when she was nearly 70, and a tour of the house left the ageing Queen feeling quite tired. According to Sir Robert Sidney's records, the Queen had to call for a staff to lean on when going upstairs to her room, now known as Queen Elizabeth's room, but she did announce that she wanted to come back another day. So the Weald of Kent and East Sussex is dotted with examples of medieval and Tudor grandeur and style, but it is also famed for its elegant town of Royal Tunbridge Wells, which came into existence during the Stuart period in the early 17th century. Until that time, the area it now covers, on the hard sandstone at the core of the Weald, was still part of the original dense Wealden forest. Nobody had cleared and colonised this area because the soil was not very fertile. You can still see some of the massive sandstone outcrops around Tunbridge Wells, for example the impressive group known as High Rocks. There's also the Toad Rock, so called because of the shape into which it has been eroded. In 1606, a young English nobleman, Lord North, discovered an iron-rich spring here as he rode through the forest on his way towards London. Others like it elsewhere in the country and in Europe had recently become fashionable because of their health-giving properties. So when he got back to court, Lord North announced the news of his find, and soon a well was sunk over the spring and a pavement built around it. Royalty and courtiers alike began to flock to the spring to take its waters, and by the end of the century, Tunbridge Wells was a flourishing and fashionable spa. Today, the town still thrives, retaining much evidence of the charm and taste for which it became famous. Perhaps the best known of its areas is the Pantiles, where the original spring can still be seen and its waters tasted. The first church had been built at Tunbridge Wells in 1678, so that those who came to take the waters needn't neglect their religious duties. The chapel, built opposite the spring, was apparently dedicated to the executed King Charles I. It was later visited by the future queens, Anne and Victoria. A modern-day feature of Tunbridge Wells is the open-air theatre, which can be enjoyed here in summer, when Shakespeare plays are performed by the Pantiles players.
I always love the Pantiles. It's got an atmosphere for Shakespeare which is all its own. If you think of it, it's so terribly similar to the sort of scenario in which Shakespeare himself produced his plays at the Globe. First of all, we've been blessed this week by the most wonderful un-English weather, haven't we? I mean, it's been gorgeous every night, and there can be very few pleasanter places to sit on a lovely summer evening than watching Shakespeare on the Pantiles. Also, it is a very, very popular play. Everybody loves Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yes, we've now done 5 shows. This show, I think, has gone very well. There's always a difficulty with extraneous noises, and I think...
Plenty of those tonight.
I learnt all the lines before I even know I got the part, and you got the part.
Yeah. But if you know the word...
With highlights ranging from theatrical art to the art of brass rubbing, this elegant spa town, which attracted so many visitors in early modern times, has much to offer the modern-day visitor too. And since 1909, it's had the prestigious title of Royal Tunbridge Wells, bestowed by Edward VII because the town had been patronised by so many royal personages. From Royal Tunbridge Wells at the heart of the Weald, up to Maidstone, the prosperous and historic county town of Kent, on its northern Greensand Ridge, and down to Dungeness, on the tip of the still expanding Romney Marsh, the Weald of Kent and East Sussex is famed for its beauty, its history, and the variety of its landscape. From imposing castles to medieval ports which are still thriving today, superseding the old smugglers' haunts. Then from tranquil orchards and rustic hop gardens to golden wheat fields and lovingly restored windmills, the features of the Weald continue to reflect the rich variety of lifestyles which it has supported for centuries. The sandstones, which were once covered only by a dense forest, are now also the setting for beautiful landscaped gardens. The National Trust maintains 2 such areas, Emmett's Garden, where an annual country fair is held in summer, and Sheffield Park, particularly spectacular in the autumn. As a region, The Weald is unique because of the series of geological processes which gave rise to it, processes which have enabled it to develop over the last millennium a vast cultural, agricultural, aesthetic and financial wealth and prosperity. So, thanks to a combination of geological and social evolution, the Weald of Kent and East Sussex is there to be explored. But while you're in the area, don't forget Rudyard Kipling's word of warning.
If you wake at midnight and hear a horse's feet, don't go drawing back the blind or looking in the street. Them that ask no questions isn't told a lie. Watch the wall, my darling, while the gentlemen go by.